started, one, thank you for coming, and two, thank you to Todd for coming. This is a pretty incredible opportunity. If you follow politics, I think you'll agree he probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Nonetheless, I'm going to ask Saul Rosario to come up and give a quick biography of Chuck Todd, and then we'll hand over the floor to him. So again, thank you all for coming.
From the suburbs of Miami, Florida, he's now one of Washington's foremost experts on political campaigns of all levels. After spending 25 years in politics, he's been editor-in-chief of the national journals The Hotline, and written countless political and media essays picked up by the likes of The Atlantic, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. He's won Emmy Awards for his reporting, and is currently the moderator of Meet the Press on NBC, the host of Meet the Press's Daily on MSNBC, and NBC News' political director, responsible for all aspects of the network's political coverage. He's broadcasted live reports from over 25 countries on 5 different continents. Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Todd.
Thank you, Saul. Thanks for inviting me. I work in television. Now, television is this box that your parents might have told you about. I'm just kidding. You know, my business is all panic that you guys are going to watch TV, and that we'll all be unemployed someday. But I'm pretty confident you're going to watch something on that little tiny screen, or we'll press the button up here and we'll get a Google Glass in front of our eyes. I want to mostly interact with you guys. Just go back and forth with Q&A, but I'll do a little quick intro, sort of how I sort of stumbled into the job that I'm in now. In many ways, my interest in politics basically started about your age. I was in 9th grade. I had a cousin of mine who was working on a campaign in Florida, a statewide campaign in Florida. He wasn't from there. He didn't know anybody. We were his family, so he stayed with us while he worked on it. In Florida, we used to elect all these different statewide offices, about 6, 7 different statewide offices. The Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Education. And so he was working on one of those. And I just got hooked. I just sort of like hung out with him. He was sort of like an older brother to me. I was an only child. So I'd go with him to during the summer, and I'd work on this campaign. And so I got kind of hooked. And so then everything in my head was, all right, I think this is what I want to do. Whatever I wanted to do, it was politics, whatever that meant. I didn't know. I wasn't thinking about journalism or media per se, but I was thinking about sort of just the world of American politics. And I got into the Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories when I was in high school. I'd read all those books. I'd read all of that stuff. Was a little bit, we had the big activism issue in the late 80s. In my senior year, and I remember getting into that, was Tiananmen Square. In 1989, there was a democracy protest in China where they literally brought out the tanks. And if you look, there's a famous picture of this lone Chinese citizen like standing before this tank that is sort of the iconic moment of that protest. So that was something that I remember being engaged in. But it was a AP government class that I really got fired up about. So what I would say is that you are if you're into this, you are in a spot. This is a very similar feeling to me. If you're here because you sort of have been animated about what's going on in government and politics. So that's sort of what got me the bug, and I was determined to come to Washington, D.C. for school, wherever that was, whether it was Georgetown, GW, George Mason. I just wanted to get up here. So I ended up at GW and just sort of stumbled into media. I volunteered on a couple of campaigns, worked a couple of part-time jobs during college, and then ended up interning at this little publication, which at the time was this technological advanced thing that we could bring to people here in Washington the news from Des Moines the same day. We could tell you what the Des Moines Register in Iowa was reporting about presidential politics. And this is 1992. And that was a big deal then. We didn't have the internet. Basically, we created a system of the internet before the internet for political professionals in Washington. So that was sort of how I got my start. The internet comes along in 1995. There were a whole bunch of older journalists who were kind of snobs about the internet. They're like, I want to write for newspapers. I don't want to write for this little internet thing. And I was 23 years old, 24 years old, I guess, at the time when we started this website. It was called Politics Now. It doesn't exist, but it was a partnership with the Washington Post, Newsweek, National Journal where I work, ABC News. And you know, an older generation being snobs about technology gave me an opportunity to suddenly, as a young person, start reporting on American politics. Whether I focused a lot on campaigns for Senate and House and gubernatorial races and things like that. And then, so I always look at that as my big break, and it's something that, it's a piece of advice I always give to younger folks that are getting into any business, which is don't become a technology snob. Because I've seen it. It was why I caught a break, because an older group of journalists thought the internet was beneath them. And every once in a while, when I say to myself, Snapchat, whatever, it's beneath me, I remind myself of 24-year-old me that says, don't be a snob about technology, because you know, I ended up growing up on that internet. You guys are growing up on a different type of technology. But if I hope to pass along what we're doing in journalism, I better not be a snob about technology. I better be platform neutral, better be as comfortable being on Snapchat as I am writing an op-ed in the New York Times print edition. And that information distribution is neutral. It doesn't matter. Everybody gets it from all sorts of different places. So you want to be in all those different places. So that's sort of how as Andrew said, he goes, you had sort of a non-traditional path into journalism, and that's sort of what it was. And I always say I feel like I caught a break when in the beginning of this digital revolution that is now flourishing, and we now have what we have. So that's just a little quick introduction to sort of how I got into what I'm doing. Before I just open it up and we can have a Q&A, a quick moment of how I sort of assess the situation that we're in now. I think we're in a period that is a whole bunch of change is happening all at the same time, not just in this country but around the world. You know, the last time we had tumult around the world like this in sort of our political systems was about 100 years ago, when we had essentially the world's economy was transitioning from an agricultural-based economy to an industrial-based economy. And this is in essentially the turn of the century, of the 19th to the 20th century. And if you think about all of that, and this is when we had you had massive migrations of populations looking for jobs. We had multiple revolutions. You had the Russian Revolution. All of them economically driven in many instances. The fall of the Ottoman Empire, World War I, how we really didn't. One of the things you learn as you grow older, as I've gotten older, is how horribly we were taught World War I and how well we are taught World War II. Basically, World War I's never ended, and we just haven't told you that. All you have to do is look at the Middle East today and realize we never finished World War I. We never solved World War I. We just sort of paused that while we ended up having progressing into World War II and at least actually ending that war. But in many ways, when you look at it, sort of the problems that we have, particularly in the Middle East, it is a derivative, you could make the case, of not properly resolving World War I. So if you fast forward 100 years where we are today, we're in an economic transition between, and now, the industrial economy and whatever we're calling this next economy. Is it a service economy, the digital, the global economy, the flatter economy, however you want to, we don't know what it is. And part of that, I think, is where this fear comes in. And that's where we have such a divide. And if you look at just the rural-urban divide we have in this country, but it's duplicated around in many other democracies, but this urban-rural divide where it feels as if the urban elites are making progress, have sort of jumped on the, hey, the global transformation train, and everybody's jumped aboard. Rural America, and in many cases, not just in America, but the rural part of this, whoa, everything is going way too fast. We're culturally changing too quickly. What happened to being able to make a decent living in my community here? Why do I have to upend my life and go somewhere else to find a new job? I think one of the big problems of our economy over the last 20 years has been a lack of domestic migration. You know, if you have an immigrant's mentality, which is no good jobs here, I'm going to move where I'm going to have a better opportunity. And if you have that mentality in this own country where you move in where it's going to get better, you're going to get better. You're going to find a better job. And so, you know, I look at, you know, and many of you might find out stories of grandparents or parents who decided they left their small town communities to move here, to go find better opportunity. And for all you know, there's probably tension in your own families because you have your Aunt Jenny or your Uncle John who never did move and think you guys are, you know, us big city people have been brainwashed or, you know, thinking in one direction, and you've lost touch with your roots, or you don't know where the past has been. So I do think that that's part of why we're in this tumult, that we have this. You've probably heard the phrase income inequality quite a bit. That's part of it, but it's almost like opportunity inequality when it comes to urban and rural America in particular. And I think that is what has created this divide. Then you throw in the distrust. It's not helpful that we have some leaders of one political party who are purposely engaging in things like trying to delegitimize the American press corps or trying to delegitimize parts of the rule of law. Those are sort of basic tent poles of a democracy, not of the American democracy, of a democracy. And if you think about it, we don't believe another country is a legitimate democracy if they don't have a legitimate justice system. We don't believe, I've always been brought up and taught that a country isn't a legitimate democracy if they don't have a free press corps, or if they don't have, or if they have, if I look at a country, in any country that has a state-run media, where it's partially funded by the state. I even struggle sometimes with BBC because of this, but they do a good job of obviously they're state-funded, but they have a distance. But most of the time, if a media organization is state-funded, it's not a legitimate media organization or a news organization. So those things, I think this is the test of our, sort of the guardrails of the American democracy, the test of the Constitution, the test of our system. It's being put through the rigors. I'm mostly optimistic that we're going to get through this, because I look back, like I said, we had plenty of tumultuousness 100 years ago. And when there is economic angst and there is this feeling of a competition for jobs, there's always immigrant bashing that comes with it. There's always cultural and bashing that comes with it, because people start reverting to their own, you know, they want to blame somebody else for their problems. I thought one of the best quotes I've read in a long time was Charles Barkley the other day. He goes, I wish people would look in the mirror and realize that's the person that is the cause of their problems, rather than looking to blame somebody else for their station in life. We do have that is something that I feel like has gotten lost a little bit, this sense of we all have our own abilities to improve our way of life if we just do it ourselves and not look for other people to blame for our place in life. So I think we're going to get through it because we have all these guardrails. The guardrails will get dented. They may get knocked down. We'll put them back up, and we'll figure this out. I do think you've seen, I look at what our role is in the media, and I view it as we have to rebuild the institutions a little bit. You know, one of the reasons why we have a credibility problem is we have blown it on some big stories. The big one that we blew in my generation is the Iraq War. When you look back at sort of national media's reporting and coverage of the Iraq War, we missed it. We didn't get it right. and I look at our coverage of this moment in American history and this moment in American politics, that we better get this one right. And our coverage of this president and all the trouble that is surrounding him a little bit, Lord help us if we really are fake news. That's what I would say, and you know, that would, you know, our credibility is hanging by a thread sometimes with some groups of people. If it turns out we've got this one wrong on what's been happening, we're going to pay a price in society. We'll be an institution that will have to be completely rebuilt. But that's sort of the advice I give to my fellow colleagues when they get worked up or they get angry in the moment because maybe you're being attacked personally by the president. I wouldn't know anything about that. That you try not to make it about you try not to personalize it back. That we try to remember, I think one of the most uncomfortable positions that I've been put in the last 5 years is suddenly I feel like I'm being dragged in as a political player. I've always viewed journalism as I'm reporting, I'm observing, you know, I want to be the fly on the wall. I want to be the person observing and the bird on the wire looking around from 30,000 feet. I'll get on the ground, I want to ask questions, I want to find out what's going on, but I'm not an actor. I'm not a participant in this. And we're being dragged in to be participants, whether we like it or not. And you get put into this situation, you know, you're biased on the other side, or you're this, or your institution is this, or that. And if we defend ourselves, then sometimes you're engaging as if you're almost accepting the premise that they're right. But there's a line. If you just always ignore and don't push back, eventually other people might believe that they're right. So you've got to try to find, I think all of us in press have been trying to struggle in how to deal, not get dragged into the middle of the fight, in the middle of the debate, while at the same time trying to improve our credibility with the public. So, you know, I look at it as we've got to show our work better. I think transparency is almost as important as fairness. Fairness to me is the number one aspect of what I do in journalism, not balance. You can't balance the truth, right? What would be what would balance the truth? A falsehood, right? A lie. So you can't balance the truth, but there is fairness. But I think transparency, showing people how we do our reporting. And a lot of news organizations, if you've noticed, we now take pains over the last couple of years to tell you our sourcing, to show you that, look, we talked to 15 people who have worked in and out of the White House. They wouldn't let us use their name for fear of political retribution. And unfortunately, even when you are that transparent with your story, the President of the United States might tweet fake news, as he did this weekend about a Washington Post story. And so, but I think over time, a lot of times, about 2 weeks later, that story will be proven 100% true, you know, by the actions that took place. I think one of the things we have to get better at in the press is showing the public, hey, see, 3 weeks ago, we reported this story. At the time, the president said it was fake news, but you need to know it wasn't. And here were the things. And I think over time, if we're transparent about it and not stick your finger in the eye about it, you know, and like, you know, spike the football, aha, we were right, but just showing that, look, this is what we do. Over time, we can improve our reputation, I think, with this skeptical. It's a good 40% of the country that's pretty skeptical of us so-called mainstream journalists. It is interesting to me when I go, my wife grew up in the Panhandle of Florida, so it's more red America. Let's just say, if I get recognized there, it's because they saw me getting beaten up on Fox News. And it is, and you do sense, if you go to different parts of the country, and if you've got family that live in different parts of the country, you could tell there's an entirely different media diet that they have, which gives them an entirely different perspective of what you think is going on compared to living here, where I feel like we're in the center of the storm. right? We're in the eye of the storm in many ways. So that's just a little introduction of sort of maybe to try to kick off the conversation. I try to touch on a little bit of everything. I'm happy to go, not just about media. It must be so hard to teach how government works anymore, since government doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. I don't know how you do that, Andrew, Mr. Orzel, but it's that part of it. I'm happy to talk about like how a bill becomes a law, because it isn't the way we used to. It isn't the way that textbook teaches you how a bill becomes a law anymore. But either way, fire away, open up. I don't know how you guys want to just.
I'm just open. I do encourage students to try to project as much as possible.
I'll repeat the question, but this feels like, is everybody hearing okay? Yeah. Anybody having any problems hearing? So anyway, fire away. Yes, sir.
So it almost has been, this previous election has been a rebuke to conventional media tactics to cover political journalism. As the gatekeepers of American politics, how do you see your strategies evolving?
Well, it's interesting. I always want to recoil when I hear the word gatekeeper. I don't believe I'm a gatekeeper. Like I said, I viewed myself as blowing through the gatekeepers when the gatekeepers wouldn't write for the internet in 1995, right? And I was my whole goal has always been, I believe that American politics has always been covered, written, and reported for elites. And I've always believed, no, more people are interested in it. You shouldn't, if you take the mindset that it's a gatekeeper mentality and this idea that, oh no, there's reporting for people that understand it, and then there's political reporting for people that don't understand it. I think that's where you create resentment, that's where you create divides, and then suddenly we're in the, and I think actually too much political coverage was too insidery, too worried about that, not enough worried about sort of the impact of the politics. I just say that just because I do recoil at the gatekeeper. But I understand why you say that, because in some ways there is an expectation, especially among the major news organizations, Times, Post, major networks, to set the standards. But the problem is, the standards are only as good as, how do you define who the media is anymore, right? The standards are only as good as sort of if your readers accept those standards. And I'm not sure that they do right now. So I could say this, how I've adjusted my reporting, a few things. One, I don't socialize with Washington power people anymore, with politicians. I've never loved it anyway. It was always a necessary evil in my book. It was always something you felt like you had to do. And I do think the perception that we as reporters were too cozy with the powerful is a legitimate criticism. And I do think, there's a movie that I love. I doubt many of you have seen it. Any of you seen Almost Famous? Okay. Philip Seymour Hoffman plays this struggling older rock journalist, and he gives this advice to the young kid, and he says, don't be friends with the rock stars. Don't become friends with the rock stars. The rock stars aren't your friends. That's true of political journalism. An elected official will do whatever they want, whatever means necessary to survive, which means if you think you've developed some relationship with some politician that is in a trustworthy nature, you're only asking for trouble at some point. And so create a little more distance. Another thing that I have recalibrated, or at least told other people, I don't care if I'm liked. I didn't get into journalism to be liked. I think there's too many of my colleagues that worry too much about what their social media feed says about their reporting. Look, if I wanted to be liked, I'd go into politics. I'd go be an elected. Go do something else if you want to do that. But in journalism, you can't. Your work is your work. So don't try to push that aside. I do think that concern about perception of how something will be received hurt the public's understanding of the election in 2016, for instance. I think too many journalists were afraid to report that half the country truly hated Hillary Clinton. I think many reporters, myself included, were afraid of saying that for fear that her campaign would accuse me personally of being sexist by saying that, or you're just saying that because she's a woman. It's like, no, it's just fact. There were, in parts of this country, people putting up signs that said Hillary for prison on their front yards. They were willing to do that. That told you, that were willing for their neighbors to see that. We weren't seeing Donald Trump for prison signs back in the 2016 campaign. I say 2016 campaign, you never know for 2020. That was a joke. But we, I think, held back, for instance, in our reporting for fear that reporting on how negatively she is perceived would be viewed as us trying to surface that, trying to create a story that wasn't there. And I think that's why so many in Washington didn't see this coming. And if you had why every one of my relatives in Michigan did know that Donald Trump was going to win Michigan. And so I do think that in that sense, that's another thing that I want to recalibrate. Don't report the story. Who cares what other people think of you? So those are, I would say, are some, and then the transparency issue that I brought up. Show our work. Don't just say you're wrong. Say, oh, that's not true. Explain why something isn't true, and be a little methodical about it when you do it. So I think those little things, it's some would say we're just going, that this is, an older journalist would say to me, oh, you're just going back to basics. And that's what I would say it is. Just go back to the basics of beat reporting journalism. Keep your head down and don't worry about the perceptions of you, of what you're doing. Worry about your reporting and making sure it's accurate. Hopefully over time, that helps. What else? Yes, ma'am.
So you said that you don't want the media to be a player in politics, but it's undeniably true that in the 2016 election, media coverage did shape how voters perceived the candidates. And so my question is, were there any mistakes in the coverage of the 2016 election, and how do you think they shaped?
Were there any mistakes? Why did you ask the question the other way? What did you do right? Can you name the one thing you guys did well? I always say is we did tell you exactly what the Trump presidency would look like. That is one thing I always say. The Trump presidency is going the exact way, how it's working, how the Trump White House works. If you read all the coverage in 2016, none of this is a surprise. Now you say that you're asking more about how the media, the television rallies, right? The idea that Trump, I can tell you what a network executive thinks. When the decision is made, do you take the Trump rally or do you take the Kasich rally, right? Well, John Kasich is a politician that says the exact same thing at 17 different rallies. So over time, and you can watch as people you can almost watch people turning their TVs off. That's what I'm giving you the network executive, I'm not giving you the journalistic, so I'm just being the cynical network executive here. Donald Trump never says the same thing twice. Never has the same position twice sometimes, but doesn't say the same thing twice. The first three letters in news is what? New. I always say this is not olds. And are we broadcasting the olds today? No, we're broadcasting news. What's new? That's what Trump got. That's what Trump understood. I always say that Trump's got two superpowers as a politician that nobody reads a room as well as that guy. And he will recalibrate his message like that when he realizes a room is going to go in one direction or another direction. You saw it the other day when he said, I'm just going to throw out these prepared remarks. It's actually a very clever way of doing that. Your audience is going, oh, right, yeah, that's great, But I remember that if you recall, the rally that sort of started his feud with the NFL, it was actually in Alabama. And he was there campaigning for a candidate that was about to lose. And this was in the primary, this was before the Roy Moore, it was for another candidate. And he realized that nobody showed up to this rally to support that candidate. And he was like, ugh, if I mention that candidate's name, they're going to start booing or walking out. So he decided, what can I say? And he found the piece of red meat. Colin Kaepernick, let me go there. Let me go with the NFL. And suddenly the crowd's going wild. Now, none of them remember why they went there. They were supposed to be there to go support Luther Strange, the Senate candidate. That guy ends up losing 2 days later. But that was Trump's ability of reading a room. The other great superpower that he has is shame, no shame. And it is something that one of our powers in journalism that we have, and one of the powers that we have in society, in our democracy, in keeping politicians from being relatively ethical human beings, is shame. You know, sometimes it's not, Anthony Weiner doesn't have to resign. There was no law that said he had to quit Congress. He was shamed out of Congress. He was shamed into resigning. Donald Trump doesn't get embarrassed by things. He has this way of compartmentalizing or not. If he feels shame, he has an interesting way of showing it. And it's an enormous superpower in a politician. If you cannot feel shame, if you're not shamed by the public going after you for 2 weeks for having an affair with an adult film actress while your wife and newborn son are at home, and that doesn't sort of rattle you publicly, and you don't think there's any, the point is that is a great power of his. So that is sort of, I think, presented a new challenge for sort of how we go about essentially trying to officiate mores and culture in politics, and I think that his inability to feel shame. But to go back to your basic question, I do think certainly all of the cable networks realized it was too much. Look, I struggle with that though. If people want to see it, should we put it out there? Then again, I can say that's what C-SPAN's for. That's what, we have multiple, we should be telling people, you want to watch the Trump rally, the whole rally, you can watch it on our digital feed and stream it over here, and we're going to go back to, and we'll let you know if something new or interesting takes place at the rally. We're trying to be better about that now. We don't just blanketly take his rallies anymore, at least on MSNBC. I can't speak for CNN. But that was something. And I would say the other difficulty that we had in 2016 is we didn't have enough resources to cover 20 major presidential candidates. We now have, I know what we've done at NBC, we've really increased our resources. When I say resources, that's another name for people. My apologies for speaking in budget speak. And we're going to be better prepared to cover 20 major presidential candidates in 2020. Because I think if you thought every Republican you ever heard of was going to run for president in 2016, any Democrat you've ever heard of is going to run for president in 2020. And I think that having more people to cover a larger field should at least make it feel as if that, okay, maybe there'll be unequal coverage between the top 5 candidates and the next 5 candidates versus unequal coverage between one candidate and everybody else. And I think the fairest shot at us is that we basically, the 2016 campaign on cable television was about 25 major candidates were running for president. When I say major, people that had, an electoral path that was fairly impressive, whether it was a former governor of Maryland on the Democratic side, a former U.S. senator on the Democratic side, or all the different governors and senators that were running on the Republican side. And yet, I'm sure all of you probably thought you only saw rallies for one candidate in 2016. So I do think that in that sense, I'd like to think that was a lesson learned. What else? Let me go back there. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering how you deal with the morality aspect of everything you cover individually and on
what's a specific
bias. Just all of the cutting throats in the White House and
well,
I just know for me it's hard to watch these things.
Well, I guess it's sort of if I've got a personal view and how I keep it out. Is that sort of your question? If I've sort of disapproved, I don't look. There's
and a mental how you.
Well, my own mental health. Well, number one. That That's a different question. Look, there was a quote the other day in the New York Times from Lisa Murkowski, a senator from Alaska, and she said, the last thing I want to do when I go home is talk about politics. I feel the same way. And can I tell you, I have loved politics my entire adult life up until the last year. And it doesn't mean I don't love what politics could be. I revere our system of government. I really do. I marvel at the Constitution all the time. It's like, God, man, those guys thought of a lot of things. You know, the Emoluments Clause. I give them credit for that. Now, we're not going to, unfortunately, this Congress has decided that they're not going to actually try to use it. But it's in there. Making sure that a foreign power essentially can't, that somebody can't. That there is a way to prevent somebody from profiting off of the presidency, and that there is a way to, there was concerns. Now, granted, their concerns were different. They were revolting against a foreign power, so they were worried that foreign power might try to bribe their way back into power, right? So they were, but my point is, I do revere our system because the structure they put into place allowed us to continue to create the more perfect union. And I am a Pollyannish on it. So in that sense, I'm not cynical about that. But I don't love where we are right now. I don't love the fact that Republicans and Democrats, that there are large chunks of them that believe that you're almost dehumanized. You know, that I worry, it's like, geez, could we all live in a foxhole together? You know, if another country invaded us, would we all look out for each other? Or would we divide ourselves up by tribe and say, okay, I'll protect that tribe, but not that tribe, and I'll protect, that's something that has me nervous a little bit every now and then. But it's interesting where I think it's appropriate for us to speak out and where we don't. When the president used a vulgarity to attack me a couple weeks ago, I was at dinner with my kids. And, my daughter's all over social media herself, Instagram, not Twitter. I won't let her do Twitter. I'm protecting her by keeping her off of Twitter, because Instagram is that much better. But it is a little bit better, actually. I'll say that. But here I was. I couldn't hide that from them. And my son, who's 10, he didn't like it. He goes, why is the president using that nasty language? And so then I felt this happened on a Saturday. And he also referred to a member of Congress, an African-American member of Congress, as low IQ. And it was just sort of a basically went up there to humiliate different people. So there is this sense of, I think there is such thing as right and wrong. That is just wrong. It would be wrong if Donald Trump were a Democrat saying it. It'd be wrong if he were a Green Party member saying it. It'd be wrong. It's just wrong. It's not how the society we want to work. And I had a representative of the Trump administration on the show. And so the question is, should politicians be asked how are they going to talk to the kids? Because I was struggling on how to talk to my kids about this. And I had to tell my son, that's a joke, don't worry about it. I didn't want him to be upset. He was upset. Hey, why is the president not like my dad? Right? That's just right. Because I go out of my way never to tell my kids how I vote. Trust me, I remember when my daughter was, during the 2012 election, she was, what would she have been, 8, 9, something like that. Apologies, they don't ask for a lot of math in politics anymore. And she had a parent came up to me and she said, oh, my son's been obsessed to find out who you're supporting, Obama or Romney. And, and he's been bugging your daughter, and your daughter told him, hey, my dad is a Republican and a Democrat. And I thought, oh, Margaret, what a great answer. And look, I always joke, Washington, we're all a company town, right? We don't all work for the same company, but we might as well, right? We all live in this bubble of Washington, and everybody talks, right? And so that's why I'll admit, I don't let my kids know. I try to keep my personal views, but there are values issues that I'm trying to instill into my kids. One thing is to respect the presidency, and here I am trying to teach him to respect the presidency, and the person that sits in that office is being disrespectful. And not accidentally, right? On purpose. And so then it becomes like, what position? If I speak out too much, then it looks like I'm playing into his hands, and it becomes the press versus Trump. And there's no way NBC's ever going to cover Trump fairly because you don't like him because he attacks you, right? So, look, I made the decision to not ask. So I had the Trump person on, and I made the decision not to ask about his attack on me. I'm a member of the press, I can take it. But I did ask about the attack on the member of Congress that he personally insulted. And then I did ask, when the president uses vulgarities, what are you supposed to tell kids? What's your advice, Secretary Mnuchin? And so I could have chosen not to ask about it at all. And it was sort of, I decided, well, look, there is a value statement here that I think, and so I just chose not to insert myself. I never played the clip where he called me the vulgarity. So that's the line I decided. I don't know if I made the right call. I'm not going to sit here and say, I think it was. I had others that say, I think, you took the high road. Most people say to me, oh, you took the high road. But I had some people say, by engaging in it at all, you let them get to you. You let them get under your skin. So I can't tell you whether or not, I can tell you, I am glad. I do feel as if people that work for him, if they think they're high character people, I do think that they should be forced to defend his words. And if they're representing him, they should have to answer for his words. So that's sort of the moral line I drew. But I'm not going to tell you whether, I hope I didn't hurt my credibility with the 40% that I was talking to you about before. I hope over time they view that positively, but I don't know. And I'll admit that was there isn't a rule book. I guess that's my way of it. And I think we're all sort of feeling around trying to figure out how to do this within reason. What else? Let me get back here. Yes, sir.
So I'm going to start off by saying I'm really glad that you said that World War I is totally underrated.
Well, underrated is not, under-taught. Yes, I don't want to say underrated. Boy, let me tell you about World War I. Everybody always gives credit to World War II, but World War I was quite the champion there.
You were talking about the social and economic comparisons between now and 100 years ago. And I was wondering, what would we have to do so that part of history doesn't just repeat itself? Because those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And there was another World War, but I mean 100 years later, looking back from time.
No, what you're saying is how do we prevent it? What you're basically saying, how do we prevent?
What can we do differently?
Can we? On one hand, I'm trying to be reassuring people. Hey, we've gone through this before, but it did take 2 world wars for us to sort of settle the century down, right? How do we prevent that from happening this time? I think part of it is I think the fact that we're so interconnected makes it harder to go to war. I just think it does. I think that there is this sense of I think that even very poor third world countries are wired now in ways, or at least the information flows to them faster than it did 100 years ago, and in some ways. So I think that interconnectivity will make, and frankly, all of the institutions that we built, the multilateral, the multi-nation institutions that we built after World War II, was essentially a structure that we put into place to prevent, so that the next time that we had these tumults, that we wouldn't end in war. But I do think we are in a fight for, just in the same way we were in the 20th century, I do think democracy and authoritarianism are about to have another confrontation. Now, I think the confrontation is going to be economic. I don't think it's going to be a hot war. I think it's going to be a cold war. of sort of, and as soon as this new economy, I think, establishes itself, and as soon as we have this perception that we can find new, look, I am worried about the future of work in this country in the next 50 years. What happens when automated driving happens? You know how many people work you know how many people drive for work, drive as their job? Truck drivers, you know, around here you would just say Uber, taxi, all that stuff, delivery services. But think about it, truck drivers and all this stuff. If we go all automated, how many millions of, these have been careers for people. How many millions of displaced, we're going to have another generation of displaced workers. Just in the same way we have basically this, currently we have a generation of displaced workers that we've had this. So I am concerned about what future of work looks like. I mean, and that's why you're going to hear all sorts of things over the next 20 years about universal incomes. You know, this fear, you know, the work week may become a 30-hour work week so that you can have more people, you can hire more people to do at companies, and if you make full-time 30 hours rather than 40 hours, I mean, there's going to be all sorts of things as our population is exploding. The demand for jobs is going to be great. So I do worry about all those things in 50 years, at least in this country. But I do think that it will at least be a Cold War, World War that we're in, rather than a hot one. But this, I mean, we are on the run. I mean, you look at China, Russia, Eastern Europe, Turkey, a lot of countries moving toward the authoritarian, find the one person that could fix it. We don't trust our system. Let's put our faith into one person. Reflexively, America has always recoiled from that mindset, except we have a president who's very comfortable working with those leaders. He has better relationships with the authoritarian leaders on a one-on-one basis than he does with our traditional allies. You know, he has a better relationship with the president of Turkey on a personal basis, who is a very questionable has a very questionable moral compass, than the president does with Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, perhaps the single most important American economic ally there is in the world. So that is this is sort of, I think, where we're headed. But I'd like to think that at least the fact that we have so many multinational pacts, even among the authoritarian countries, that our war will be cold rather than hot. Let me go back here. Yes, sir.
So clearly the administration right now has caused a lot of changes in the media. Which of those changes do you think are lasting changes that will extend past this administration?
Which media? Because I think that he is, I think a lot of it has to do with the success or failure of this administration. If this administration is considered a success, then I think the mainstream news media will become obsolete completely. I think that if it's a failure, if it's perceived that this was a failure for Republicans or a failure for the party or the party, and then I think, and this idea, you know, and look, all of it is always based on wins and losses in election year, right? So if Democrats, you know, sweep the midterms in 2018 and turn Trump out of the White House in 2020, then you're going to have a whole bunch of Republicans say, you know what, this media world that we create, this conservative echo chamber is a problem. It's not an asset anymore. It's now a liability. And it's causing us an inability to talk to middle-of-the-road voters, to talk to the middle. So a lot of this is going to be decided on these based on election results and based on where I think that the conservative echo chamber is a very powerful tool with about 30% of the country. But if over time it is perceived that is limiting the Republican Party's ability to win elections and govern, then it gets recalibrated. But right now, it's a tool that got them into power. but it's also a tool that prevents them from governing. So it could be the same tool that also ends up costing them control of the House, control of the Senate, and eventually control of the presidency. So I think a lot of it will be based on what the American public decides on whether they endorse this style of governance or not, and then we in the media will recalibrate based on that. Yes, sir.
I know you've had a lot of interviews on your show, and I really enjoy watching you interview because when you ask them a question and they don't respond, you really call them out on it.
I tried.
So I just want to say, I guess my question is a two-part question. What's your most memorable interview? And after the Kellyanne Conway interview, what were you thinking?
Well, the Kellyanne Conway interview is usually the one I get asked about the most. The interview that I enjoyed the most, and it was the hardest interview that I've ever prepared for, was actually one with Dick Cheney. And it was during the week that the so-called torture report was released. And I say so-called because the CIA doesn't believe they did any torturing during the first 10 years, and the Senate Democrats believe it was torture. And former Vice President Cheney was willing to come on and basically defend the tactics. But he also, one thing I've covered him a long time, I've known him. He's easily one of the smartest people I've ever interacted with. And it's like, it had to be, I had to know this stuff as well as, so it was one of the, and I knew it was also going to be a little tense, because I knew he had a tough point of view, and at the same time, I knew this was a very polarizing topic. And I take the view in these interviews, a piece of advice that the founder of or one of the founders of Meet the Press, a guy named Lawrence Spivak, used to say, which is the basic way to figure out how to question a politician is learn everything you can about them, and ask them from the opposite political point of view, right? Make them defend their stances by essentially taking the opposite point of view. So if you have a conservative Republican, ask them from a premise of a liberal Democrat and vice versa. So that one was the toughest and the one, and it's one I'm proud of because I feel like the interview was about the information. What I liked about the interview is nobody walked away from that interview thinking anything about Cheney or Todd. They were like the substance of the report. And so in some ways that's the perfect interview in my book for a Meet the Press, where you feel as if the point of these interviews is to get information out, not to humiliate somebody or to score a victory over a person. On the Kellyanne Conway thing, so I'll tell you a little backstory on that. I was pretty upset that Saturday as somebody who spent 6 years as a White House correspondent, as somebody who I revere our democracy. I believe that podium is pretty sacred too. That podium, people that speak from that podium in that press room, you got to remember the presidency of the United States is the spokesperson for democracy and freedom for the world. And if you don't accept that's one of your responsibilities when you go work in that White House and when you get elected to the presidency, that one of the things that it is demanded of you is that you are the spokesperson for democracy and freedom. And we set the example for freedom of the press and freedom of expression and freedom of religion. I mean, that we are supposed to be the shining city on the global hill. And so when the very first action of the press secretary, of the spokesperson for the office of the presidency, is to lie to the American public from that podium. And that podium, that's where wars get declared. That's where wars can sometimes get declared, or military, certainly military conflicts get announced. Major declarations get announced, and you're lying about crowd size. And it's like, I know why they did it, because the president told them to do it. And I wanted to make Kellyanne say it. I'll fully admit it. I was like, at least just tell the truth. Who asked him to go out there and mislead the public? And by the way, I asked one question, the entire 22-minute interview. I just kept asking it over. Okay, but some variations of it. So I'll admit I was just sort of, the thing is, I've known Kellyanne Conway. It's goes back to the rock star question, right? Don't be careful your friend. I wouldn't say we were friends, but it was somebody that my wife and she were pregnant at the same time, and I remember having, we were more than just your phony Washington acquaintances. I consider, and so it was so the other part of it was just like, it's like, you know better. Like, I knew she knew better. I'm not going to say any of the, but that's part of it. I think part of the distrust of the media and of politicians in general is that most of you watch all of us and sit there and say, you're BSing us. You're not saying what you're really thinking, or you're not saying what the real truth is. And that's sort of, the longer I'm sort of going about this job in this current environment, the more I'm like, maybe nuance gets lost anymore. Maybe I need to be a little more raw sometimes. But when she said alternative facts, I was like, and I remember just walking like, well, that's good. Immediately it was like, well, that phrase is that's going to leave a mark. You just sort of knew that was a phrase that was never going to go away. But it has made me make a decision. I will not put anybody on that I don't think has information to share with the viewer. So unless she has something to announce, I can't imagine a scenario where I'd book her. I'm not going to book somebody on Sunday Meet the Press to just spin. Hopefully, you're now I only want to put people on who at least are going to explain a policy proposal from their point of view. And I think that is something else. I think there are a few, and I think she's one of them. I think she wants to perform on television. I don't want to book people that are just interested in performing. Because if you're just in it, and if it's just about performance art for you, well, that over time is what delegitimizes us in the eyes of you. Because then it all looks like an entertainment show. And the more it looks like a show, the less credibility all of us have. So anyway.
I think we have time for one more question.
All right. Do you want to pick it, or do I have to pick it? Let me go back. Let me go back here. Yes, sir. I just don't. I don't make sure I don't want to leave anybody out here. Yes, you do. You're right. Yes, sir.
I was just thinking, as you try to make sure that your show doesn't turn into a show, how do you balance that with your network executives trying to get high ratings and make it entertaining while trying to maintain journalistic integrity?
Well, it's interesting. Here's something that my EP and I always talk about. If your ratings are good, network executives leave you alone. I've been lucky. I think there's something, what's been interesting about Sunday morning is this sense of uncertainty and chaos during the week has actually brought more people to the Sunday television couch. It's not just us. It's all the sort of the five major Sunday morning shows have all of our boats have risen. And so and our ratings are doing really well, so I've not felt any pressure at all on the network side. There's pressure sometimes on the cable side and that's where there's some tension. I am well aware of the neighborhood I do my news show in. And I know that I do a news show that on every day at 5 o'clock, well, 4 days a week at 5 o'clock. Mondays are my day of rest. And I'm aware, I view it as a news and analysis show, sort of wrapping up the day, sort of what mattered and what didn't. That's sort of my mantra. Like, what is our ultimate goal? We're trying to tell you the stuff you should have been paying attention to versus the chaos of the day that's pointless and that you can ignore. But I know that I'm on a channel who's got a pretty strong opinion in about an hour after I'm off the air, and they move in another direction. So that can create perceived pressure. Sometimes it's viewer pressure. Sometimes viewers will go to Fox or something like that because they don't think I'm left enough or whatever on MSNBC or whatever it is. Everybody's got, sometimes people view the perception of a channel and apply it to the individual person. And that's something that I'm trying desperately not to have. I want my credibility to be judged on me, not just because of the Peacock. I'm well aware the Peacock gives me this large platform, but hopefully, and it can, I don't want it to be totally defining of, I want it to define the values of our journalism, and that we better be, look, I don't care if our point of view at night, our editorial page at night, leans left or right, as long as it's truthful and factual. And one thing I will say is our folks, I believe, are truthful and factual. You know, you can disagree with their prescriptions. You may not agree with all their prescriptions, but the facts behind it are there. And that, to me, as long as that continues, then I'm very comfortable staying, you know, and sort of pushing back sometimes at my executives. But my executives will say we all need each other. Sure that there are some people that want to go on and feel good at night, either left or right, and just hear information that they already agree with. But in order for that information to be credible, you need to be taken as credibly. They need to know that the news people are credible, that are their colleagues. So the good news is that I haven't felt that much pressure, but that doesn't mean if our ratings went down, I can't. We are a business, and we are a for-profit business. Maybe that's the problem, and that's a whole nother discussion on journalism and media that we could have here. But as long as we're a for-profit business, I'm always going to have to be somewhat sensitive to ratings. So my view is, how do you take the same information and just make it a little more interesting, right? Like that should be my job. You know, how do you a little bit of sugar to help the medicine go down? If you've ever heard of that saying. Anyway, you guys were great. I expected this. I expected to be a little overwhelmed by how engaged you guys are, and I was. So thank you very much.
I would like to know.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Orzel.
Applause from you, but your statement that you agreed with Senator Murkowski that the last thing you want to do at home is talk politics. And on your one
I feel bad
day
about
off,
that.
you came here to talk politics. So thank you very, very much for being here.
And I just want to be able to say this phrase once: I will always remember these Titans. So there.